And so, you know, it's a one-time blip, but there's time, so I wouldn't be worried about that. Institutions that use the profile form and let's say do early decision or early action, you may actually see financial aid information from those institutions in December prior to when the FAFSA comes out, because they'll have data through the profile and awarding their own institutional funds, and they'll estimate any federal funds. So it's going to be a year of you know, a little bit different, but I am confident that everyone will be able to make an informed decision and have good data in which to do that. It is really important, and it's highlighted here, it's underlined, you know, meet application deadlines. I think institutions have gotten better over the years of, you know, being flexible, like having deadlines, but accepting after deadlines. But there have been institutions that have limited funds, and they're going to use that application deadline to potentially, you know, cut off, or maybe a student receives less because they haven't met a deadline. So that really is important to make sure you're meeting deadlines. So the FAFSA form, the free application for federal student aid. As I said, anyone who's applying for financial aid would need to be using this form and applying. It's the FAFSA Simplification Act. It was put into law December 27th, 2020. I remember the day well. And thankfully, they pushed off. It was supposed to start in the 23-24 academic year, and they wisely, it got pushed off an additional year because there was so much that had to go into that and that had to happen. But one of the things that's coming out of that is the FAFSA currently has about 108 questions. Depending, because it's a SMART application, so as you're answering questions, you might you know, be collapsed out, you know, and not have to answer further questions. But the most questions a student family would have to answer is about 36. That's what the new 24-25 FAFSA will have. Again, available just for this 1 year only, coming up in December rather than October, but otherwise after that it will open October 1st. This login with an FSA ID, that is another thing that is slightly changing. There still will be an FSA ID that a parent and student will need to have, but what they're recommending, right, this is really kind of an electronic signature is what that FSA ID is. You use it to log in, it is your kind of identity. Along in this year and moving forward, that FSA ID, we would usually say that a student has to have one, and at least one parent in a two-parent household has to have that FSA ID, because it used to be that the FAFSA just signed by one parent. The process now, because there's a change to how the data comes in from the IRS, is that there's a consent process that happens with that FSA ID, and they're suggesting that every parent who is going to have information on that FAFSA form should have an FSA ID. I'm not going to go too deep into that, and I know that there'll be more presentations as we go into the fall, and so there's plenty of time before you even need to be kind of thinking about this, but just know that there's this process of getting an FSA ID, a federal student aid ID, and likely, you know, in a two-parent household, maybe two parents might need that. It used to be that one of the changes they're making is that you would, as you're completing the FAFSA, you get kind of sent out and you authorize, I'm going outside of the FAFSA form to the IRS site and bringing that information in, and it gets populated, and it was you know, X'd out, you couldn't see that, but you brought it in. It was called the data retrieval tool, and this new process and why it requires this consent and falls under like IRS regulations is it's a direct data exchange, so it's automatically flowing in, and you're actually not going to see it, and it gets directly to an institution, but it's a direct data exchange. And then, yes, it does have to be completed each year. Again, if you're accessing any sort of financial aid, many institutions will use this to help calculate funds not just from the government or the state, but also their own institution. What's reported on the FAFSA? There is general information, kind of biographic, demographic information about the student, where the student is applying. Typically, you can just type in the institution's name, it will come up. There's also things called a federal student code, right, for an institution. Back when I applied to college, you needed to know that code because you had to write it in on a paper FAFSA form. But these days, it's quite easy. You can just kind of type in and have that school populate. You can put up to 10 schools on a FAFSA form. If a student wants to apply to more than 10, I usually say kind of prioritize the earliest deadlines, put those schools on. We get that information fairly quickly within, say, 48 hours. Though if a student signed the FAFSA and a parent hadn't yet signed it, right, their data was on there, but it wasn't signed. Actually, they hold that in for about 7 days in a holding pattern before they send it on to the school. So that would be the one scenario where we don't get it right within about 48 hours. But my point is that you can actually then remove schools, add a new school on the FAFSA, and then that institution will get the information. At the end of the day, when the student decides, you know, come May 1st, where they want to attend, just make sure that if you had to remove schools, make sure that institution is still listed on the FAFSA so that they can, you know, potentially make any updates if they need to, or new updates come in. So here's another change that actually is coming for this coming year with whose information is on the FAFSA. So I mentioned parent or parents. In the current iteration of the FAFSA form, the parent or parents that are on the FAFSA that their data is collected is if a parents of the student are married or unmarried and biological parents or adopted parents of the student and they're living together, their information is on the FAFSA form. In the case of divorced or separated parents who are living separately, I've had situations where they say that they're separated or divorced and they're still living in the same household. So in that case, they would still have both parents' information. But divorced or separated and living separately, currently it is who the child lives with more, and that parent's information is to be on the FAFSA form. It is changing to be who provides more financial support to that child, and it's that parent's information that is to be listed on the FAFSA form. In the current iteration where it was who does the child live with more, they said, you know, if it was, well, it lives 50-50, the student lives 50-50, then the second line of defense was, well, who provides more support? That is the child. But now that is becoming who should be completing the FAFSA form. And legal guardians are not a parent, and I think that's the last bit of that parent discussion. Here's the one kind of thing that's actually going to get taken out. They're going to still ask how many people are in your household, and of those people that are young adults, children of you, or dependents of you, how many are in college? So they're still going to ask that question, but it is no longer, that number in college figure is no longer going to affect the kind of final output, which used to be called an expected family contribution. Let me give an example. In a family has one child in college, and let's say it comes down and says that expected family contribution, that what this family, you know, can kind of contribute to her college is $10,000. If they had two in college, it would be $5,000 for child one, $5,000 child two. beginning with that 24-25 year, that will no longer at the bottom line affect that, that figure. So number in college is not coming into play. So that is a change. I can certainly get into kind of the federal government's reasoning for all of that. It really comes down to, with the FAFSA simplification, of making it easier for Pell Grant students. That's the only real grant funding, scholarship funding that the government is providing, of understanding what they might be eligible for. And by taking that out, they can create a chart based on just family size and income level of what a student will be eligible for in Pell Grant funding. I will also say that Pell Grant funding is significantly increasing in scope of who will be eligible. So in the data that I'm running with my own student population, I'm seeing about a 26% increase in students who are actually eligible for Pell. So that is a good thing. I will also say that in the data that I'm looking at, when I isolated on people who have 2 in college, it's not that for everyone. I looked at the average and it was increasing by about 49%, not 100%. That output. So not everyone is going to see that that it's like, say, doubling from what it might be if they in a prior year had applied. There's a lot of changes to the allowances in the formula that are more generous. So I would say that in the data that I'm looking at, and my colleagues who have been looking at information for their students and comparing what it will look like, we're seeing that more students will be eligible for more in funding. And that really outweighs, you know, kind of a small population that may see a difference. Additionally, institutions are going to do their best with their own funding to try to keep things as consistent and similar to what they've done in the past, because once again, I would say institutional funding is really, you know, provides a significant amount of the aid that is available in scholarship and grant funding for students. Are there any questions on anything that I've gone over yet? Yeah. Can this money be used in different countries? No, this is all specific to within, you know, the United States. Yeah. Whoops. So additional information on the FAFSA. As I mentioned, it will be 2022 tax information for the 24-25 FAFSA. And actually, this second bullet point, or the sub-bullet point there where it says both taxed and untaxed, it is both taxed and untaxed, but that's actually something that is another significant change, is that when the law came out, it was we're tasked with the only financial income information that can be on the FAFSA has to be verified through a tax return. So, and I'll give an example of something that is a benefit, right, is that as far as untaxed income, money that a parent puts into a retirement account, right, that might show up on your W-2, a 401k, 403b, that always had to be included as untaxed income. I apologize for my computer making that noise. But that no longer is true. So we no longer have to include that retirement untaxed income on the FAFSA form because it can't be verified through that direct data exchange. So the untaxed income that would be included, untaxed interest income that comes off on the tax return, and a couple of other data points, but really very few, quite honestly. And then parent and student asset information. So you'll see here include saving, checking, investment, other property. This is another change. That second sub-bullet include all 529 accounts owned by a student or parent. So if you have a 529 account, right, typically that's going to be the asset of the parent, and the student is the beneficiary, which is a good thing because parent assets are assessed at a much smaller percentage, about 5%, as compared to students, where it's about 20%. So that's a good thing. One of the things that was always difficult when doing a presentation like this, and someone would ask, so do I only include the 529 account I had for this child that I'm applying for, or do I have to include, like, let's say I have 3 children and I have 529 accounts for all of them? And we would say, you're supposed to include all of them. They've made a change for this upcoming year and forward that you're no longer having to include for the other child. It would only be what you have for the child that you're completing the FAFSA for. And you do not include as an asset your primary home, the value of retirement, or life insurance. So that is not asked about, and that information does not need to be provided. And just debt is not anything that is kind of reported on the FAFSA, except, of course, you know, debt against your primary home. So no. Not that, sorry. Any investments, if you happen to have debt, you know, debt against something, you're providing that difference. But that's the only kind of debt information that would be provided. You're going to, nope, I went backwards. Any questions on the FAFSA form before I move on to the profile? Okay. So the CSS profile, you know, I have worked in both forms. I have sat with families and completed both forms. There's so much that goes into the, you know, because it's through the government and talked about, like, FAFSA simplification, make this easier, make this easier. The profile is a challenging form to fill out because it asks so much more information. So it's similar to the FAFSA, that it's asking some income information, but then there's a whole lot more that goes into it. Some institutions, and typically, as I said, it's about 250-ish institutions that use the profile. Typically, these are institutions that are mostly awarding just need-based aid, not merit aid. They have significant institutional funds that they're awarding, and so they need to be stewarding those funds in the best possible way. So they require more information. Those institutions may also, when I worked at Harvard, we had the FAFSA, the profile. We collected tax returns from every family, business returns, if those were something that you had as well. And we looked at all of that information. And so if the institution requires the profile, there's also a cost associated where the FAFSA is free. If a student typically is eligible for, like, a fee waiver for the SAT, they would be eligible for a fee waiver for the profile, but it is, otherwise it's $25 for the first school and $16 to send to any additional schools. It does become available October 1st, just like the FAFSA, but in this 1 year where the FAFSA is going to not be available until December, this will still be available October 1st. I'm trying to get a sense from my colleagues at other schools if they might, you know, start using the profile. I don't think I'm going to see a large group of schools that will go into deciding to use the profile for this 1 year. But, you know, perhaps we may see a few that add on. And also quite different than the FAFSA is that even though the profile form itself would also only be collecting information, financial information about the, as they kind of call, like, the custodial parent, there is a non-custodial profile form. And so information has to get sent to that non-custodial parent, and they have to complete that as well. Nothing ever crosses. No one can see, like, the student and the custodial parent can't see any of the information that the non-custodial parent completed, and vice versa. It all just goes to the institution. But that is also a difference with that profile form. And then perhaps an institution may have their own financial aid application. I think many institutions have gotten rid of that. But just again, to my point in the beginning of making sure that the student goes on to the website and and I'm a checklist person, so I would be institution A, you know, what forms, what deadlines. Institution B, the same. And so that they know for each of those institutions what they need to do. After you have applied, colleges and the state of Massachusetts will receive your information from the FAFSA, the state. The profile will only go to the institutions that you selected that it needed to go to. The student will receive something called a student aid report. It's basically output from the FAFSA form and kind of lists out everything that you put on there. It also gives some information to you and tells you if there's anything that might need to be followed up on. In completing the FAFSA form, there is no place for you to alert, right, that, hey, me in 2022 looks very different from me now, like edging into 2024, right? And so you have to complete the form as it is. And then it's a process of, let's say you've had a job change, you had a job loss or some sort of medical emergency in your family, right? And that's not something that you can actually list on that FAFSA form. You need to be in touch with a financial aid office directly in that scenario. Most institutions that will have some sort of appeal process, like a need-based appeal process. It might vary. There might be an online form you can fill out. What pretty much every institution I can guarantee will ask for is some sort of written narrative as well as documentation. So if you're saying, gosh, 2023, I wasn't working for half the year, my income is very different, they're going to ask for a copy of that 2023 tax return and be able to use something that's called professional judgment to make changes to FAFSA data. We're bound by rules to collect documentation and to be making notes and documenting any changes that we make. But that ability does exist. Yeah. Yes. So the profile is also based on 2022 data, but plot twist, the fun part is that you'll be also telling them about like 23 and then what you think 24 is going to be, which sometimes for families is like, I don't know. And so sometimes they just repeat it because, who knows what 2 years ahead might look like. But yes, but the base year is 2022, and you're answering the most amount of detail on that 22. The 23 and 24 are pretty minimal. On the profile form, there is a very small section that you can actually kind of write in some special circumstances. But even in that scenario, I suggest you reach out directly to the financial aid office. I would say in most cases, most institutions are going to say, after you've actually received, you've been admitted and received a financial aid package from that institution, then at that point, reach out about any changes. My hope is that this the fourth bullet point here, the fourth number here just goes away. But in the past, we as the financial aid office have been required to verify certain data. So the FAFSA form randomly selects students that we have to then verify that the tax data, certain tax data elements are correct, and that we would collect a verification worksheet that verifies the household size and number in college. With everything being verified through direct data exchange, except in certain circumstances, there are some, right, non-filing, things like that, and no longer having number in college have an effect, my hope is that verification goes away altogether. I was at a conference in the fall where someone at the Department of Ed said, well, it might look different. So they haven't yet said anything, but my hope and what I expect is if there's anything, it's really minimal, and it might be for those outliers that somehow can't use the direct data exchange. So that should be one process that kind of is eliminated, which has always been a block in the process, particularly for our low-income students, because when I use my air quotes, randomly selected, oftentimes it's students who are receiving a Pell Grant, because that's the real kind of grant scholarship money that the government has. So colleges, we're going to review information and determine what a student's financial aid award will look like. I'm going to skip verification. This is, I've really kind of already talked about that. We're your friend in this process. Reach out to us, ask questions, have your child ask questions. And I've already kind of talked about special circumstances and what that would look like. So we're going to move on to how financial decisions are made. So there's a basic formula, which is the cost of attendance of an institution. Right now, minus the EFC, it will be minus the SAI, and I'll talk about that in another slide, and then that equals a student's financial aid eligibility. So the beginning of that is cost of attendance. And so you see over on the right-hand side that the cost of attendance is made up of both kind of billed or direct expenses, as well as unbilled or indirect expenses. So your billed expenses, tuition fees, room and board if the student is living on campus. If not on campus, just tuition and fees. And then non-billed or indirect expenses are books, supplies, transportation, personal expenses. We include those for a couple of reasons. One, it increases your financial aid eligibility. Two, it provides the student, the family, a better sense of what 1 year costs, because there are other costs in this, not just tuition fees, room and board, but hey, we have to drive or fly to an institution to drop the student off. Books have to be purchased and personal expenses. I would say that books, supplies, transportation, personal expenses, when I looked at them in my own budget for students, oftentimes you might not even be spending, these figures. And so I will give a suggestion that when you're, say, comparing financial aid across schools, what I typically do is, and if I sit down with a family who's looking at multiple, I say, let's just look at the direct costs and then start with just grants and scholarships against that. So we can get an apples to apples comparison of these institutions, right? Because if those direct costs are a lot more and you're thinking, oh, but I got all this financial aid, right? But it might not be, that different than another institution that maybe the cost is a little bit less. Because for the most part, those indirect expenses are going to be the same at any institution, right? Unless you're flying across the country, right? And you're having an increased cost for travel. So that's the cost of attendance. And then what was formerly called the expected family contribution, which was always a kind of a hard way to explain to a family that really what it is an indicator that determines eligibility for federal funds, rather than this expected family contribution and thinking this is what I'm paying for our cost. And so this change to calling it a student aid index is kind of to acknowledge that it really is kind of this index figure. But the general formula of cost of attendance minus what was EFC, so minus SAI, is still determines eligibility. Kind of an amount a family has the ability to absorb in college costs, not that that's kind of right output. It is the same formula used for every family. Some colleges are also going to use that eligibility figure and that SAI to determine their institutional need-based funds, right? So if an institution does not use the profile form and they have need-based funds, they're using that SAI figure. And so hopefully that kind of goes away, that somehow this that expected family contribution figure is like, that's what I'm paying, and you might get focused on that because it's not necessarily what the family will pay. And when we look at some examples of financial aid awards, I can kind of help put a visual to that bullet point. And there are EFC calculators which will be changed to SAI calculators probably in the coming months. So again, I've already mentioned what the formula is. So cost of attendance minus SAI is a student's financial aid eligibility. And so this is an example. I don't think at any institution you're going to see a chart like this when you receive the financial aid package. But here's an example of a cost of attendance of an institution that's $45,000. And the family's SAI is $5,000. So their eligibility for funding is $40,000. And here, this student is receiving a grant and a scholarship. Side note, grant, the word grant typically relates to need-based funding. And that word scholarship, typically you're going to see attached to merit-based funding or funding given for some other, some reason. So they're receiving $27,500 in free money, right, that does not need to be repaid. That figure that I referenced, the $5,500, they can borrow, the student can borrow that funding from the government. They have been allotted that they can earn up to $2,000 in work-study funding. And so when you add those grant, scholarship, loans, work-study up, there is what is called unmet need, right? So to get up to the $40,000, another $5,000 is needed. So this is where I'll circle back to the outside scholarships and where it can be worth the work. Is because if a student really has their heart set on a particular institution and there's some sort of gap there, and they have some outside scholarships that can go to fill in that unmet need category, it helps kind of reduce that gap, so it can be worth the work. The things that I would just throw out there that I would say to my own children and that I say to my own students is just so much goes into that first year and trying to kind of get everything together for that first year. Is that scholarship renewable, right? And like, does that scholarship make the difference, and is it renewable, and will it continue for further years? But it can definitely be worth the work. I do want to just point out here with work study, when we looked at the cost of attendance, there were the direct expenses and then those indirect expenses. Grant and scholarship and loans will automatically go toward the direct expenses on the student account or bill that's received. Work study is not. The student receives a page. They have to actively get a job on campus. Oftentimes, they'll be designated as work study job, and they get a paycheck. And how it relates to that cost of attendance is it often is helping with those indirect expenses, right? So maybe books, personal. Maybe as a family it's decided that they have to work and help pay toward the spring bill. That gets determined, personally amongst your family, but typically that's where students are using that work study funding. So when you look at a financial aid package on a letter, I'd just like to point that out because oftentimes you'll see it all listed together, and sometimes you might think like, oh, all of this against what that tuition is, but that work study is not something that's going to go toward directly toward the tuition bill. So every institution has to have what's called a net price calculator on their website that is to provide students, families, a sense of someone who looks like me financially. What did they receive in funding in the year that is just passed? And some institutions will also provide like merit funding as well. So they, in the questionnaire, it's not just asking income information, but it might ask, you know, GPA or test scores or something like that. So then it provides someone who looks like me and my family financially and me academically and what they might receive. Okay. Those net price calculators can be helpful in the process, particularly, I would say, and that's why I think this is such a wonderful presentation and information to provide at this point, that as you're going through that research part and trying to look at schools with your child that, you know, maybe academically is a fit or kind of personally it feels like a fit, but looking at that financial fit at the same time, so you get a sense of, rather than just that kind of sticker price, like, but what does this really look like? And there are, so those, that can be helpful. This is to show that, as I said before, it depends, right? Every school is different in what they have available. So this is for, and for ease of example, the cost of attendance is the same at each institution. You're not going to see that, right? You're going to see ranges. The student aid index is the same, so eligibility is the same, but just to be able to compare that kind of apples to apples comparison. And so you see at, you know, big differences between college A, B, and C, where college A is an institution that maybe meets full need, right? And so they're seeing this more significant grant and scholarship funding, and there's no unmet need. And then college B, you know, it's just less in grant and scholarship A, and then college C, the same. So the reality is that you're going to see differences, and it can be challenging, right, to have that. And what I typically probably say around this time in the presentation is just my own suggestion from the experiences that I've had over, you know, 26, 27 years of doing this, and sometimes seeing where conversations were not had. And I distinctly remember one phone conversation with a dad who was, they'd already deposited, they'd already received the bill, and they were now late to pay the bill. It was August, right? May, you know, they deposited. And he didn't want to disappoint his child, that like it wasn't going to be feasible, right, as far as the funding. And so that conversation had never happened, and then it happens in such a tough time. Or when the child, like when you're trying to decide on that May 1st deadline, and then the conversation happens. So my suggestion is just to be open and have those conversations around cost, along with the conversations with college. Obviously, that's fully up to you and your own kind of personal style, but to kind of put that on the table and have discussions around cost is better to happen earlier than later. On this slide, what I kind of would point out here is, don't just look at that bottom line, right? That total figure of 35,000 and think, oh, everything is the same, right? This is the same cost, because what I call trickery. I would hope that most institutions don't do this, but yet I know that there are some institutions, and I've seen examples where when this financial aid information comes and they insert a parent loan into the information about what the student is eligible for. Yeah, and exactly that face. That is, in my personal opinion, is not okay. And because I've seen instances where people just kind of are looking at the bottom line, because there's no standardization on award letters either, and it can be confusing. So just make sure you're looking at each detail. But a parent loan is a choice, A. When they put it on there, they'll put it on as like a federal plus loan, right? So it's a choice if you want to borrow, and a choice where you would borrow from, right? Whether it's the federal government or through private, you know, scholarship sources. So that's the kind of tip on that slide. Any questions on kind of award letter before I move into the ending part where we kind of talk about paying for college? Yeah. A net price calculator can be done at any point. Yep. All right, so paying for college. It's going to take me a while to get used to saying SAI instead of EFC when you've said something for so many years, but kind of that unmet need and paying the amount due really is what this looks at. So this example, and really I think the main point here is that it doesn't have to just come from one source. Just like any large purchase, you might be tapping into various sources. So here, it's saying that the balance due is $20,000. And so perhaps there is some of this that is coming from savings, so past income. Maybe part of it is student savings, that the student has to be making that active payment, and maybe part from parent savings or what have you. And perhaps some is coming from present, so current kind of wages. One of the nice things is that you get a bill for the fall for half the year, and then you'll get a bill for the spring term. But pretty much every institution now has payment plans available as well. So rather than just having to pay the amount that's due minus any financial aid right out of pocket just for the fall, you can break that up over 4 or 5 months for that fall term payment. And many institutions also have it so that you can decide well, perhaps I'm going to make an out-of-pocket payment from some savings, maybe some from a 529, maybe some from a loan, and the rest I might stretch out, or I'm going to pay it. So again, it doesn't have to be just one way. Payment plans, usually there's no interest, but typically there might be a small fee, anywhere from $25 to $40, something like that, to enroll in the payment plan. And so perhaps there is some that might be coming from future income, right? So from some sort of education loan. And I believe there's another slide that goes into that. There's not, but I think I'll just go back one slide really quickly to just briefly touch on this, because you've absorbed a lot of information in this presentation. I appreciate you being here and at this time of year. I was saying to someone, I know that I always feel in June, with my kids, it's I'm done by when June comes of kind of doing things. You just feel tired within the year. So I just basically, it's seed planting, right, with this information about other loans, right, aside from those student loans. The federal government has something called a Federal Plus Loan. Parent Loan for Undergraduate Students is what that acronym stands for. And it's not a bad loan, and for some families that might be their only option, because it's a very basic check that there's not delinquent accounts, right? So it's not a full-blown credit check and looking at your credit score, and then and your interest rate is based on that. Everyone gets the same interest rate for that loan. One thing, and I was actually just in DC a couple of weeks ago advocating to eliminate this, is that all of the federal loans have an origination fee. On the student side, it's only about 1.057%, but on that plus loan, which is parents as well as grad students, it's 4.228%. So it's not insignificant, and so that you basically are borrowing a higher amount, and then you net a little bit smaller that goes toward that bill. So I just do like to point that out. On the private education loan side, there's a host of options available. Those are really more, right, think of a home loan, a car loan, any sort of loan that you're going out. They're looking at your credit score, right, and depending on that, depends on what your interest rate might be. So if you have really good credit, you might benefit from a low interest rate, and most of the private education loans do not have origination fees, but it can be overwhelming And most institutions have the information about the PLUS loan on their website, because in order to have anything else, you have to have at least 3 lenders, and it can be hard to know, because they do change, what is best. So there are resources available, something called Elm Select, where you can actually go in and just look at a group of lenders that an institution kind of approves to put information on their that site. Oh my goodness, I just forgot what I was going to say. Oh, if you, say, belong to a credit union, look into any funding that might be available through there, because a lot of times they have funding available, loans for students. AAA, some of them have funding. They also have people who will help people actually complete like their forms, like the CSS profile, which I was amazed at. I also talk about like state entities. So here in Massachusetts, MIFA has funding available, and then in some other states, not that it matters here in this case, but sometimes through like an education department. Our state of Massachusetts education department doesn't have funding, but MIFA is a not-for-profit state authority, so somewhat similar. So those are just some other things that you could look at, but never feel like you have to go with whatever institution, whatever they might have as lenders. It's always your choice to borrow, where you might want to borrow from, but my suggestion is just doing that research and seeing what makes sense for you and your family. And typically on the private side, so on that PLUS loan, it's in the parent name. On the private side, oftentimes it's in the student's name and the parent is a co-signer on that loan. Because typically an undergraduate student can never get a private loan, but the parent is a co-signer. And so another thing is that there are some lenders out there that have something called a co-signer release. So once in repayment on that loan, after so many on-time payments, you're released off that loan. Right, so just a couple of nuggets to remember later on. So kitchen table conversation. So I guess maybe I started some of my stuff a little early, but what is each school's net price? There are options, right? So perhaps a student wants to start at a community college first, and that might be a way to save in funding. In Massachusetts, there's actually, I will say that from the time that I first started in financial aid until now, and I sit on a Massachusetts State Financial Aid Advisory Committee, the amount of funding that's available through the state has greatly increased, and particularly with this upcoming budget. So there's significant dollars that go toward the community college and state systems from the state of Massachusetts. And there are options to start at a community college, and there's guaranteed credits that will transfer to the state system, and if certain GPA is met, then there's funding that goes along with that. So there certainly are options available, and I know sometimes what can be hard is that kind of pressure, right? Like with friends or neighbors, like, oh, they're going to this school, or and sometimes that kind of gets swirled up. But there are wonderful educational opportunities, in our state with all of the institutions that we have, as well as outside the state too. Consider the number of children you will send to college. I always, when I talk about the whole number in college and how it affects, I always talk about my sister-in-law and brother-in-law have 5 children that are all spaced like 3, 4, 5 years apart. And I was like, what are you doing? Now, their kids are almost all through school. They have one who's in Germany as a captain in the Army, and then and he's got to be 30-something, and then the youngest one is just finishing her freshman year in high school. So what a range. But for them, they never benefited from that number in college, really. And then, looking at debt and starting salary. There's lots of calculators out there. I oftentimes will sit down with students and just look at that. Like, hey, what are you thinking that you might want to do? Well, if you don't know, what's the average salary coming out of a 4-year school? And relate that to what you might be borrowing. very conservative. They say student loan payments shouldn't be more than 8 to 10% of gross income. So that's kind of a measure that you can use. And that's really conservative. I see plenty of people who go above that, but that's a really conservative, good number to use. That $300 figure is well under that, 8 to 10% of the average, you know, coming out of a four-year institution, at least last year anyway. And then, is the student considering graduate school? You know, and what does that, you know, look like for them? Just things to think about. I already kind of talked a little bit about Massachusetts, but you know, completing the FAFSA form, that data is going to get to the state of Massachusetts. They'll assess if the student is eligible for any sort of Massachusetts need-based funding. And the state has done a lot to update their website and try to provide more and more information to students and families. I already talked about the mass transfer, and also if a student was looking at one of our state institutions and the program wasn't available here, there can be a tuition break at other New England schools rather than having to pay the out-of-state tuition. Almost done. So there are free resources here in Massachusetts. FAFSA Day, Massachusetts has been a wonderful part of our state financial aid organization, has one of their committees that runs this. I was tri-chair for many years, and COVID kind of threw things off a little bit, but we did kind of transition and do Zoom sessions where we could even go into breakout rooms with people that mimicked what we normally had done. Was we had about 30 sites across the state of Massachusetts that one-on-one help completing the FAFSA form. And I will say that I had experiences where for some people, just knowing that there was someone there that they could ask a question should they get tripped up, right? That we have volunteers who work in the profession there. We're figuring out what this will look like for the coming year and beyond, because the form is changing so much, and some of the anxiety in completing the form was trying to answer those financial questions. AGI, taxes paid, where does this, and that is actually going to be pulled out because it's a direct data exchange, and it will just flow in rather than having to answer these questions. So we're kind of figuring out what that looks like. I'm sure we're going to have some sort of support, but just know that it may look different than it has in the past. Massachusetts has the Educational Opportunity Centers. I believe there's one in the basement of the Boston Public Library that is a place where you can get free help, financial aid help, and career readiness help as well. So I am happy to send this presentation to everyone, because you did miss those beginning slides. Hopefully you were able to follow along with me. I think in my own brain this is probably overwhelming right at this point in the presentation, sitting through it. But this is something that you can look back on, as you sit down with your young adult, because this is really, going through like June, then fall, winter, spring, so something that you can kind of hold on to. But there's nothing really that you need to do right in this moment. When I'm doing this presentation in the fall, it's like, get your FSA ID, make sure you have that and this, that, and the other thing. But right now, it's just a little bit like absorb, right? And maybe start to have those conversations and doing some tours and things like that. Yep, so I wouldn't even suggest getting the FSA ID or anything. But I would say as you're looking at and having those conversations, right, just start making lists, looking at websites, just to start to dabble. You have that time, so use it. And then these are just, ways to connect with MIFA. I've been volunteering with MIFA for probably 24 years. So I do this as a volunteer service. I go to a lot of high schools. I believe in them. When I first was doing this, I would always sign up for their emails to make sure that, if I'm telling someone else to sign up and that this is good information, that I believe in that as well. They do so much, not only for students and families, but also for, counselors in the state of Massachusetts. They put on training to provide information. I was just on a panel today for school counselors around the changes that are happening. So they do really great work, and they provide great information. They have a podcast. You can follow that on their YouTube channel. And I think that's it. So are there any lingering questions? Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if you can answer it. So my daughter's thinking of doing early decision.
Yep.
Early decision. So since they moved the FAFSA timeline out to December, how long do you typically have between the time that you find out whether you're accepted or not? I'm just concerned, would we be able to see the financial aid packages before she has to reply back as to whether or not she's interested?
So that's a great question. Just make sure everyone heard it. Wanting to apply early decision. So let me just first define that for everyone and the differences. So early decision is a process that some institutions have where you're pretty much committing that so you can only apply to one school early decision, and that if you get in, you're going to that institution, barring any, if the financial aid kind of part of it doesn't work out. And then there's early action, which is non-binding. So early decision is binding to that school. Early action is non-binding, where you're just learning early, right? But you have choice, and you can apply to more than one school early action. So the question was, wanting to apply early decision with these. Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Well, but let me just finish, because so the question was, thought that early decision and the FAFSA coming later, how would we know? So for early decision for this 1 year, all of those schools use the profile form, and so they're going to be providing information, early and kind of upfront there. For early action, it's going to depend on the school, right? So I have early action, but I'm using the FAFSA form, so I'm not going to be able to provide information until probably at least January, later in January, to students. But students do not have to make a decision for early action until May 1st. So you have plenty of time to receive the information, absorb the information, ask questions, what have you, before having to commit and make a decision for that May 1st. But I'm glad you asked that question and that you didn't know, where you said early decision, because I think that's an important point as well. And I did a presentation for some boarding school counselors, and they were asking about early decision and, well, is it going to be accurate? And I said, actually, compared to when there was early decision and the FAFSA never opened until January 1st, and people were using estimates to try and so it was an estimated financial aid award. This is actually going to be more accurate because it's using that 2022 that is said and done and already filed, so should be a little bit easier in that way. Other? Well, you've been a great audience, and hopefully this was helpful. My kind of line right now that I'm going with is remain calm. We'll get through it, and perhaps I'll see you in the fall.